Imagine waking up in a country where your newspaper has vanished, your neighbors whisper instead of talk, and the law no longer protects you from power. It serves power. Imagine living like that for 4 years, watching friends disappear, watching flags and uniforms change the meaning of ordinary streets, and then on a Sunday morning you look up and see paratroopers pouring out of the sky. You don't know their names. You don't know what their politics are. You only know what they represent, the end of a nightmare. Who are they? As William Wild Bill Guaner remembered people saying, "They're angels." That line is not Hollywood. It's the voice of someone who understood something modern life makes easy to forget. Civilization is not permanent. Freedom is not guaranteed. And in World War II, it was not saved by words alone. It was saved by men who bled in hedgerows, froze in forests, drowned under artillery fire on beaches, and kept moving forward even when the world looked like it belonged to darkness. Today, a growing crowd of revisionists tries to drain the moral clarity from that struggle. They point at every wartime tragedy and declare the whole cause a myth. They find a late-life veteran's bitterness and treat it like a verdict on history. They ask, what did they die for? And they imply that if modern America is troubled, then those sacrifices were pointless. But that is a way of laughing at shadows because the night has passed. It is exactly what people do when they have forgotten what the night was. The truth is that America's role in World War II was, in its core, both defensively necessary and morally righteous, even if not every action taken in that war was morally clean. The United States fought because it was attacked, because its survival and security were at stake, and because if the Axis powers, especially Nazi Germany, had reshaped the world, the very concept of a free world would have been gutted. That is why Americans for generations called it the Good War, and why the men and women who carried it are remembered as the greatest generation. That phrase is not meant to deny their humanity or turn them into saints. It is meant to acknowledge the scale of what they faced and the seriousness with which they met it. This is not an argument that America was perfect. It is an argument that the cause was just, the enemy was monstrous, and the alternative to American involvement was a world in which freedom, democracy, and human dignity would have had far fewer places to live. To understand why this war remains morally distinct, you have to start with the enemy and the stakes. Nazi Germany was not simply another rival with a different flag. It was a regime that fused industrial modernity with ideological cruelty. It sought conquest, yes, but conquest with a purpose. The reordering of Europe according to racial hierarchy and the elimination of peoples it deemed unworthy to exist. Occupation under Nazi rule was not merely governance by foreigners. It was a system of fear. Censorship, reprisals, forced labor, starvation policies, hostage killings, and the constant presence of a secret police state. In many occupied nations, daily life became a calculation of survival. What can you say? What can you read? Who can you trust? When a state's ideology treats human beings as categories to be managed, removed, or exterminated, there is no safe corner of life. There is only compliance, resistance, and consequences. This is why liberation became more than a military term. It became a human longing, and when it arrived, when American soldiers and other Allied forces pushed the occupiers back, it felt like the return of oxygen. It felt like the restoration of a world where normal life might be possible again. And yet, the United States did not enter this war like an empire hungry for conquest. For much of its history, America tried to avoid foreign entanglements, fearing that European power politics would infect the young republic. Even as Nazi aggression spread in the 1930s, the United States remained reluctant to send troops overseas. Americans remembered World War I's slaughter. They were still bruised by the Great Depression. They had oceans on either side and a deep instinct to believe distance could preserve them. This reluctance matters because it proves something essential about America's entry into World War II. It was not the product of casual adventurism. It was forced by events. It was forced by attack. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, killing thousands and striking the U.S. Navy in a surprise blow intended to cripple American power in the Pacific. Overnight, the debate about whether the war was over there ended because the war had come home. The United States declared war on Japan, and Germany subsequently declared war on the United States. From the American perspective, then, World War II was at heart a defensive war. The enemy fired first. That is not a detail you can reinterpret away. It is a foundational fact that places America's war in the category of legitimate self-defense. But defensive necessity does not exhaust the meaning of America's role, because once the United States entered the war, it confronted the nature of the enemy in a way that transformed the conflict into a war of liberation. As American soldiers fought across North Africa, Italy, and then into Western Europe, they met the reality of occupied nations and the machinery of Nazi brutality. Revisionist accounts sometimes speak as if America fought a conventional war between comparable moral sides. But the reality was that the enemy included the SS, an apparatus that committed atrocities as a matter of policy, and a regime that built concentration camps where human beings were worked, starved, and murdered at industrial scale. When Allied forces liberated camps, they did not merely discover bad things happened. They discovered a system designed to erase people. That discovery did not create the righteousness of the Allied cause from nothing. It confirmed it. It showed that defeating Nazi Germany was not merely about strategy or prestige. It was about stopping an ideology that had turned modern administration into a weapon against humanity. This is where modern revisionism often performs a sleight of hand. It points to Allied moral failures, the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the internment of Japanese Americans, and it implies that these acts prove the war's righteousness is a myth. But moral reasoning is not a game where you find one sin and declare the whole cause a lie. The existence of moral complexity does not erase moral reality. Yes, the Allied bombing campaigns and the use of atomic weapons raise serious questions, and responsible Americans can debate them without flinching. But these actions were not launched to exterminate populations as an ideological goal. They were operations intended, rightly or wrongly, to strike the enemy's war machine and end the conflict sooner. In total war, where industrial production and transport become the bloodstream of military capacity, leaders made decisions aimed at shortening a conflict that was consuming millions. You can disagree with their judgments. You can mourn the dead. But you cannot treat these decisions as morally equivalent to Nazi policy, because Nazi policy was the deliberate creation of a world where certain people were meant to be eliminated. Moral analysis collapses when it refuses to distinguish between tragic methods used to end an aggressor's war and the aggressor's ideological project itself. The atomic bombings in particular demand sobriety, not slogans. They ended enormous human lives in moments, and that horror deserves remembrance. But they occurred in a context where American leaders believed an invasion of Japan would be catastrophically costly, and where the Pacific War had already demonstrated that fighting could produce staggering casualties. The decision, as those leaders saw it, was tied to ending the war sooner and sparing American lives and perhaps lives on both sides that would be lost in prolonged conflict. People can debate whether alternatives existed, but using that debate to declare the entire American cause unrighteous is not history. It is an attempt to erase the difference between a war begun by aggression and ideology, and a war fought in response to attack, and in pursuit of ending a regime that had already proven itself murderous on a civilizational scale. The internment of Japanese Americans was a grave injustice and should be named as such. It violated liberties and treated people as suspects based largely on ethnicity and fear. But even here, the existence of injustice inside a democracy is not proof that the democracy's war against totalitarianism was meaningless. In fact, it reveals a crucial difference between a flawed constitutional order and a regime built on terror. Democracies can commit wrongs, and those wrongs can later be condemned, debated, and corrected. Totalitarian regimes do not correct their core crimes because their crimes are the point. Nazi Germany's atrocities were not deviations, they were central. That distinction does not absolve the internment. It simply prevents a dishonest conclusion that because America sinned, it therefore fought for nothing. That is the trap of moral equivalence, and it is one of the easiest ways to talk yourself out of gratitude for civilization's survival. A deeper problem with revisionist arguments is not what they criticize, but what they omit. When critics spend their energy on Allied bombing and internment while barely mentioning concentration camps, occupied nations, SS brutality, and the slaughter of civilians by Nazi forces, they create a distorted moral frame. They airbrush out the heart of the evil being confronted. In reality, Nazi occupation brought suffering to nations like Poland and Holland, and German forces committed atrocities across Europe. Civilians were killed casually, resistance was punished collectively, and terror was used as policy. Many concentration camps were liberated by Allied forces, including Americans, and that liberation was not a side effect. It was one of the war's most profound moral consequences. When the American army came at last, captive nations of Western Europe welcomed American soldiers as liberators, angels, in Guaner's phrase, not because they believed Americans were perfect, but because they knew what continued occupation meant. Even German soldiers and civilians often viewed Americans as comparatively merciful conquerors. There are stories, small but revealing, of American officers insisting on discipline and restraint. One paratrooper recalled being ordered by his commanding officer to return a pet rabbit to a German family rather than taking it for food. Details like that matter because they show that American victory, while violent in battle, often aimed to be restrained in conquest. In the closing days of the war, German soldiers scrambled to surrender to American forces rather than to the Soviets, fearing Soviet vengeance. This reality is not meant to glorify America at the expense of others. It is meant to describe how people experience the difference between armies and regimes. The way you win matters. The way you occupy matters. The character of victory shapes whether peace can be built. Some of the most moving evidence of what America's effort meant comes from the fact that even some descendants of Nazi soldiers later expressed gratitude for what American soldiers did. In one striking case described in the article, the grandson of a German soldier killed in the war wrote to the American soldier who had shot him, saying he and his father held no anger and acknowledging that Germany's war was wrong, that what Americans and Allies risked to free Europe was invaluable, and that their ability to grow up in peace was owed to those who brought down the Nazi regime. That kind of statement is not propaganda, it is historical testimony. It shows that even among the defeated, there was an awareness that the alternative to Allied victory was not simply Germany wins. It was the continuation of a regime that had already proven itself morally catastrophic. Revisionists also often minimize America's military contribution, claiming that despite D-Day heroics, it was the Red Army that defeated the Nazis, not the Americans. This claim has a kernel of truth. Soviet sacrifice on the Eastern Front was staggering, but it becomes misleading when used to erase the Western Allies' strategic role and America's indispensable contribution. World War II was a coalition war. Germany was defeated by being forced to fight a multi-front war against opponents who could sustain pressure and replace losses. The West's alliance with Stalin was an unsavory necessity. It took both East and West to crush the Nazi war machine. Even Soviet leaders understood, at least materially, how Western production and aid mattered. And the fact that Hitler's forces nearly won the war despite American participation should be enough to destroy the fantasy that America's role was optional. If Germany could come close to victory with America in the war, what would have happened without America's men, money, and industrial output? This is where the revisionist habit of reading history backwards becomes dangerous. Because we know the outcome, we treat it as inevitable. It was not. Counterhistory is risky, but there are certain counterfactuals that reveal how close the world came to disaster. What if D-Day had failed? Eisenhower feared that possibility enough to prepare a statement taking responsibility. Analysts at the time knew the invasion could collapse. If the landings had failed, the war's timeline could have changed dramatically, perhaps fatally. It could have delayed a Western front long enough for Germany to stabilize defenses, prolong the war, or shift resources east. And then consider the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's winter 1944-45 offensive aimed at breaking the Western Allies and reaching critical objectives like the port of Antwerp. That offensive came close enough to success to terrify Allied commanders. If Germany had succeeded, it might have shifted the balance, and a changed balance in the West could have echoed in the East. The point is not to claim we can prove these alternate outcomes. The point is to remember that the free world's survival was not guaranteed. There were moments when catastrophe was plausible. Those catastrophes did not happen because American and Allied forces held, fought, and won. There is another reason it mattered that the Red Army did not single-handedly defeat Nazi Germany, even if one grants the hypothetical that it could have. What would Europe have looked like if the Soviet Union had won the war alone? We do not have to guess. We saw the Cold War. We saw Eastern Europe's decades under communist rule. Repression, censorship, secret police states, crushed uprisings, and constrained life. The hot war bled into the Cold War as Soviet power expanded westward. In the closing days of the war, American forces pushed east in part to limit Soviet occupation and ensure that as many Europeans as possible would live freely under a post-war order shaped by Western democracies, rather than trading fascist tyranny for communist tyranny. They could not prevent the tragedy of Poland, Hungary, and others falling under Soviet domination. But they did help ensure that Western Europe, France, the Low Countries, Italy, and West Germany rebuilt under freer institutions. This is part of what it means to say America saved the free world. America helped prevent the entire European continent from falling under a single totalitarian sphere after the Nazis were defeated. Not content to indict the Allied war effort, revisionists often disparage the heroism of World War II soldiers, as if the idea of the greatest generation is just sentimental reverence. They claim most soldiers simply wanted to go home, as if that fact cancels courage. Of course soldiers wanted to go home. Wanting to go home is not the opposite of heroism. It is what makes heroism meaningful. The question is whether they wanted to go home regardless of duty, or whether they wanted to go home after the job was done. The record shows countless examples of young men lying about their age to enlist, of volunteers rejected for enlistment who despaired, of wounded soldiers who resisted going home and tried to rejoin their units, of men who disguised wounds so they could return sooner. Many World War II soldiers feared failing their duty more than they feared the enemy. Veterans of later wars have often spoken of them with special respect. This is not because those men were magically better people. It is because the demands placed on them were enormous and because, again and again, they endured. In evaluating the righteousness of America's role in World War II, critics sometimes forget the simplest fact. The war came to America. Pearl Harbor happened. Germany declared war. The United States did not start the conflict. It responded. From the American perspective, it was a defensive war. But it also became a war for liberation, the liberation of oppressed peoples and the defeat of regimes whose ideology made brutality a mission. That is why the war remains morally distinct. This is why Americans have long been justified in celebrating it as the good war, even while acknowledging that war is always tragic and that Allied decisions can be debated and criticized. The most emotionally powerful revisionist argument is the one built around the sadness of veterans who felt their comrades died for nothing, especially when those veterans looked at modern America and felt it had crumbled morally or socially. That sadness is understandable. It is human nature to look at the present and feel grief for what seems lost. But it becomes a trap when it turns into consequentialism, the idea that a cause becomes worthless if the future is disappointing. The righteousness of resisting Nazi Germany does not depend on whether modern America always lives up to its ideals. The men who fought did not fight to guarantee a perfect future. They fought to prevent a clearly visible evil from triumphing. They fought so their children could live under a constitutional system rather than under a racial empire. They fought so that Europe could be liberated rather than permanently enslaved. The fact that later generations may squander blessings does not erase the value of the blessings or the righteousness of the struggle that preserved them. So the conclusion of this story is not that America was flawless, or that America has a permanent moral monopoly stamped on its passport for all time. The conclusion is narrower, harder, and more honest. In World War II, America fought a defensive war forced upon it by attack, and in fighting it, America helped liberate oppressed peoples, defeat a genocidal tyranny, and shape a post-war space where freedom could survive and expand. That claim is not a request for blind patriotism. It is a judgment about what was happening in the world between 1939 and 1945, and about what would likely have happened if the United States had not entered the fight with its manpower, its industrial scale, its naval reach, and its willingness to endure staggering losses until the job was finished. The war was righteous not because every act was pure, not because every decision made in Washington or London was beyond criticism, and not because war itself ever becomes clean. The war was righteous because the cause was necessary, and the alternative was catastrophic. Sometimes history places humanity in a position where the choices are not between good and bad, but between bad and worse, between bloodshed now and slavery later, between sacrifice and surrender. World War II was one of those moments, and the righteousness of America's cause rests on that reality. If you want to feel the weight of that statement instead of merely hearing it, stop for a moment and imagine the world that could have been, not as a vague dystopia, but as a plausible outcome based on what the Axis powers were already doing wherever they were in control. Imagine a Europe consolidated under Nazi rule not temporarily, not for a few years, but as the dominant political fact of the century. Imagine extermination normalized, not as a crime revealed and punished, but as an administrative policy refined and expanded. Imagine resistance movements gradually broken by terror, informants, reprisals, and the steady grinding down of hope. Imagine speech controlled, newspapers turned into instruments of propaganda, education redesigned to raise children into ideological obedience. Imagine independent churches pressured, infiltrated, or shattered, civil society absorbed into party structures, ordinary associations treated as threats. Imagine a continent where law does not restrain power but serves power, where the state's ideology decides who counts as fully human, where rights are a word used only by enemies of the regime. And then imagine the United States, isolated across oceans that would no longer function as safe buffers, facing a hostile superempire dominating the world's industrial heartland, a power with the resources, technology, and manpower to project influence globally. In such a world, America's own freedom would not remain untouched. Even if invasion never came, the entire strategic environment would change. Trade routes would be threatened. Allies would vanish, diplomatic options would shrink, the American Republic would live under constant pressure, a fortress of democracy surrounded by hostile ideology and aggressive power. The world would not be different. It would be unrecognizable. Now compare that imagined world built not on fantasy but on Nazi practice to the world that actually emerged. It was scarred by war, yes. It was filled with graveyards, ruined cities, refugees, and trauma that lasted for generations. But it was also a world in which Western Europe rebuilt into democratic prosperity, where countries devastated by occupation regained the chance to govern themselves, where free elections, free speech, and civil society could return and grow. It was a world in which even Germany itself, after being defeated, could eventually become a free and stable nation, rather than remaining the engine of a racial empire. It was a world in which the language of human rights became part of global moral life precisely because humanity had seen what happens when such rights are erased and when civilization is redefined as obedience to terror. That world is imperfect. It contains hypocrisy, injustice, and conflict. But it is free in ways the Axis world would not have been. And that difference exists because millions fought, including Americans, and because hundreds of thousands of Americans died. The world you know, the one where people can argue in public, vote out governments, criticize leaders, worship freely, publish books that insult the powerful, build independent institutions, and dream of a life not determined by ideology, did not survive by accident. It survived because it was defended. And this is why it matters to resist the shallow modern impulse to treat moral complexity as proof that no moral judgment can be made. The Allied side committed acts that deserve debate and, in some cases, condemnation. There were tragic decisions and terrible injustices, but the presence of tragedy does not erase the reality of evil, and the existence of imperfection does not erase the necessity of resistance. A righteous cause is not a claim that everything done was righteous. It is a claim that the war's fundamental purpose, to stop aggressive conquest and genocide, to defend the nation after attack, to liberate those under oppression, was just. If you refuse to make that distinction, you do not become more mature. You become morally blind because you end up treating the deliberate project of extermination as equivalent to the tragic and contested decisions made in the effort to stop it. The result is not fairness. The result is a world where words like liberation lose meaning, where defense becomes suspicious, and where the only moral posture left is cynical shrugging. That cynicism is not wisdom. It is what happens when the night has passed and people forget how dark it was. This is also why the final note of this story should not be a victory lap. It should be a reminder. The greatest tribute to the men who fought World War II is not empty reverence, and it is not cynicism that pretends their sacrifice was pointless. It is clarity. It is the refusal to forget what they faced and what they prevented. It is the courage to admit America was not perfect then and is not perfect now, while still insisting that defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was one of the most necessary acts of collective defense and liberation in human history. Clarity does not mean propaganda. It means remembering what the enemy was and what victory prevented. It means remembering that the free world is not a poetic phrase. It is a description of a political space where people can live without being owned by the state. It means remembering that such a space can collapse, and that when it does, it is often rebuilt only at a cost paid in blood. When someone tells you those soldiers died for nothing, it is worth responding with empathy before argument, because behind that claim is often grief, grief that modern life feels degraded, grief that politics feels broken, grief that blessings feel wasted. Some veterans themselves, late in life, looked at the country they had defended and felt sorrow or even disgust. That feeling is understandable, but it becomes a moral mistake when it turns into a verdict on the past. A righteous cause does not become unrighteous because later generations misbehave. A sacrifice does not become pointless because the inheritors of that sacrifice are careless. The men who fought did not fight to guarantee that their grandchildren would always be wise. They fought so their grandchildren could exist in a world where wisdom and foolishness could both be expressed without secret police. They fought so their families could live under a constitutional system rather than under a racial empire. They fought so that Europe would not remain a prison continent, and so that the idea of liberty would still have ground to stand on. The fact that modern societies sometimes squander freedom does not prove freedom was not worth saving. It proves that freedom is real, because only free people can squander it. So answer with the simplest truth, and say it without embarrassment. They did not die for nothing. They died so that Europe would not remain a prison continent. They died so that extermination would not become the organizing principle of modern civilization. They died so that the world would still contain places where governments could be changed without firing squads, where people could speak without fear, where human beings were not graded by race and sentenced by ideology. They died so that families could rebuild, that churches could reopen, that newspapers could print without permission from tyrants, that nations could recover their voices. They died so that the 20th century would not belong entirely to totalitarianism. They died so that the very idea of human dignity could survive long enough to be defended again and again, imperfectly but persistently, by those who came after. They died so that freedom would still have a home on earth, and because they fought, it did. And if you want a final line that carries both pride and responsibility, let it be this. The men who won World War II did not hand us a perfect world. They handed us a world where perfection is still allowed to be pursued. That is what tyrannies take away first, not only lives, but the possibility of striving, the space to reform, the right to hope. The greatest honor we can offer the greatest generation is not to freeze them into a museum or turn them into slogans. It is to remember why they fought and to take seriously the inheritance they secured. Because if their war teaches anything, it is that freedom is not a permanent possession. It is a living condition that must be defended, sometimes with speeches and votes, sometimes with courage and in the worst hours of history, sometimes with everything,